Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the perfect storm of paranoia, religious extremism, and flawed justice that fueled the infamous Salem Witch Trials. It's this dark, totally fascinating chapter of history that usually just gets reduced to caricatures of women wearing pointy hats. But the reality of what actually went down in 1692, it's far more complex and honestly, way more terrifying. Let's kick things off by just looking at the sheer scale of the panic. Between February 1692 and May 1693, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft in Colonial, Massachusetts. Over 200. This wasn't just a handful of isolated incidents in one tiny village. The accusations spread like wildfire from Salem Village to neighboring towns like Andover and Topsfield, pulling dozens of communities across New England into this massive, terrifying web of suspicion. And tragically, the courts found 30 people guilty. 19 of those individuals, 14 women and 5 men, were executed by hanging. On top of that, at least 5 other people died while just languishing in these awful, disease-ridden jails waiting for their day in court. This death toll made it the absolute deadliest witch hunt in the history of colonial North America. Then there's the story of one man, an 81-year-old farmer named Giles Corey, who suffered an even more brutal fate. He died under gruesome torture, literally pressed to death beneath heavy stones, simply because he refused to enter a legal plea before a court that he knew, for a fact, was deeply corrupted.
So to really understand how a society descends into this kind of madness, we're going to follow a roadmap today. First, we'll look at the Puritan tinderbox. Second, the spark of accusation. Third, the trials and spectral evidence. And finally, we'll look at how the hysteria subsides.
Starting with Section 1, the Puritan tinderbox. We have to establish the highly volatile state of Massachusetts in 1692. Basically, this was a society just waiting for a match to be struck. The people of New England weren't just sitting around looking for witches out of nowhere. They were living in an environment packed with extreme compounding anxieties.
What's really fascinating here is that Salem wasn't merely superstitious. They were under immense psychological and political stress. They were dealing with violent frontier conflicts during King William's War, which sent a massive flood of traumatized refugees pouring into Essex County. On top of that, their royal charter had actually been revoked in 1684, so they were essentially operating without a formal constitutional government. Now add in a vicious, polarizing local feud between 2 prominent families, the Putnams and the Porters, plus endless bickering over their super controversial minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, and, well, you've got a community pushed to its absolute breaking point.
Now, when we look at the demographic reality of the accusations, a staggering 78% of the accused were women. And this wasn't just some random coincidence. It was deeply, deeply woven into the very fabric of their worldview. See, the core issue was that Puritan society inherently viewed women, especially those who didn't perfectly conform to their incredibly strict social norms, as inherently sinful, and therefore prime targets for demonic possession. They firmly believed that while men and women were equal in the eyes of God, the devil specifically targeted women because their souls were allegedly unprotected in weak and vulnerable bodies. It's a harsh perspective, but absolutely crucial for understanding what happened next. Moving on to Section 2, the spark of accusation. With that tinderbox fully primed, let's look at the initial spark that ignited this deadly panic. Interestingly, it didn't start with adults pointing fingers at each other. No, it started with the bizarre behavior of children inside the local parsonage. The real, terrifying catalyst was the inexplicable physical contortions and fits of 2 young girls, 9-year-old Betty Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams. They were screaming, throwing things around the house, crawling under furniture, and complaining of being pinched and pricked with invisible pins. When a local doctor couldn't attribute these symptoms to epilepsy or any known natural disease, well, the community quickly jumped to the conclusion that the devil was at work.
And the very first people targeted? They were outcasts who perfectly fit the community's worst prejudices, leaving them entirely defenseless against the girls' claims. You had Sarah Good, who was a destitute beggar, then Sarah Osborne, a woman with a scandalous reputation who skipped church and was tangled up in property disputes, and Tituba, an enslaved woman from the West Indies. Her ethnic differences and supposed tales of magic made her an obvious, easy scapegoat. Basically, they were the usual suspects for a terrified community desperately looking for someone to blame.
The paranoia got so intense that a neighbor actually instructed an enslaved man named John Indian to bake what they called a witch cake. Get this, it was a bizarre concoction of rye meal mixed with the afflicted girl's urine, and then they fed it to a dog. The idea was to somehow reveal the witch. Even the local reverend strongly condemned this, pointing out the absolute absurdity of using the devil's tools to fight the devil. But by that point, the panic was already completely out of his control. All right, Section 3, Trials and Spectral Evidence. Now we reach the climax of our explainer. We're going to see how the justice system itself actually weaponized this community panic into a lethal machine. Because remember, this wasn't just a mob with pitchforks. This was a formal, government-sanctioned legal process.
While it looks like a perfectly structured legal process on paper, moving from a formal complaint to a public interrogation, then to a grand jury, and finally a trial before the special court of Oyer and Terminer, we'll see that the actual evidence permitted in these steps completely bypass normal rational logic.
Incredibly, you could be condemned to hang based entirely on what they called spectral evidence. What is that? Well, it was basically an invisible vision that only your accuser claimed they could see. The court actually believed that the devil could not take the shape of an innocent person without their explicit permission. Therefore, if a teenager cried out in the middle of court that your invisible ghost was biting them, the judges accepted that as ironclad proof that you had signed a literal pact with Satan. Crazy, right?
They also relied heavily on the deeply flawed touch test. Here's how it worked. Accused individuals were blindfolded, and their hands were physically forced onto the afflicted girls, who were supposedly right in the middle of a demonic fit. If the girls suddenly stopped thrashing and claimed they were cured by the touch, the blindfolded defendants were doomed. They were essentially trapped by the physical reactions of the very people accusing them. It was a completely rigged game from the start. To really understand the sheer brutality of this legal framework, let's go back to Giles Corey. Knowing the court was an absolute sham that hadn't cleared a single person at trial, he protested by refusing to say guilty or not guilty. He just stayed silent. So, to force a plea out of him, the sheriff subjected him to an archaic torture method called peine forte et dure. They literally crushed him under increasingly heavy stones for 2 whole days until he died. He endured all of that agony rather than validating the corrupt trial with a plea. The pure hypocrisy of these trials is probably best captured by the chilling execution of Reverend George Burroughs. Puritan lore strictly dictated that a witch could not possibly recite the Lord's Prayer without stumbling. Yet standing right there on the gallows ladder, Burroughs flawlessly and fervently recited the entire prayer. It was so moving, it drew tears from the crowd, and they almost stepped in to stop the execution. But Reverend Cotton Mather, watching from his horse, quickly reminded the crowd that the devil could transform into an angel of light. And so, the hangings continued anyway.
Which brings us to Section 4. The hysteria subsides. Finally, we need to examine how this fever broke and how the authorities scrambled to extinguish the fire they had fanned so heavily. Because eventually, the sheer volume and audacity of the accusations caused the entire system to collapse right under its own weight. Prominent ministers finally began circulating urgent warnings. Even Cotton Mather, who remember had initially supported the courts, along with his father Increase Mather, started arguing that spectral evidence was an incredibly dangerous basis for execution. They warned that, actually, scratch that, the devil could in fact masquerade as an innocent, virtuous person, which meant the invisible visions the court relied on to hang people were completely untrustworthy. But the ultimate reality check occurred when the accusations spiraled so high up the social ladder that Governor William Phipps's own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was named as a suspect. I mean, talk about a wake-up call. Realizing the utter chaos and having just returned from the war front to find his jails literally overflowing, Governor Phipps finally stepped in and completely dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692. Once spectral evidence was officially thrown out by the newly formed Superior Court in early 1693, the conviction rate absolutely plummeted. By May, the final trials concluded, and Governor Phipps pardoned the remaining prisoners, bringing an end to the horrific timeline, just a little over a year after those very first fits began. Over the next 2 decades, the government slowly, quietly admitted its catastrophic mistakes, declaring the trials unlawful and compensating the survivors. So, what's the big takeaway here? What you should take away from this explainer is that Salem wasn't just about magic or some outdated superstitions. It was a devastating, monumental, systemic failure. It was a terrifying moment where the very people trusted to protect the innocent, the magistrates, the judges, the clergy, instead completely abandoned evidence and logic. They essentially enabled a localized mass murder, all fueled by petty community grudges and blinding fear. And I'll leave you with this provocative thought. When due process is completely abandoned in favor of mass paranoia,
as we saw with how easily a society can be whipped into a frenzy when stressed by political instability. Are we truly immune to mass hysteria today? Or do we still carry the exact same human tinderbox, just waiting for a new spark? Thank you so much for exploring the anatomy of this hysteria with me. Keep asking questions and keep digging into the history.